guys, hi, how's it going? How y'all doing today? Hopefully today finds you well. Today I am doing the next video in my palette roulette series in which I pick a palette or two, or in this case 3, and I utilize them for a period of time, and then I come back to you, talk to you about the palettes, the good, the bad, the ugly, and show you some pictures of the looks I was able to do with said palettes, and then we do it all over again. We pick new palettes and we do this again later. If that sounds like something you're interested in, I do hope that you keep on watching. Today we're actually going through some really exciting palettes. So I have the Smoke Sessions Volume 2 by Melt, the Fatally Yours by Melt, and the Patrick Ta Major Dimensions 3 palette as well, and I'm so excited about them, and I hope that you are too. So for those of you that are new here, hi, my name is Donna. I'm a field leader for Ulta Beauty. I love talking about makeup and self-care. This is my self-care, so I hope that you find that this channel brings joy to your life and the way it brings joy to mine, and that you'll want to stick around and subscribe before you go. But with that said, let's roll into this palette roulette in which I'm talking about these palettes right here, and then we'll get you out of here. All right, so I did have 3 palettes that I was meandering through this week, and I think my most exciting palettes are these 2 here, which are the Melt palettes that I brought into this palette roulette this week. Smoke Sessions 2 and the Bailey Sarian Fatally Yours palette, and then the Patrick Ta palette is just kind of the semblance of normalcy that I needed to go with the 2 palettes that I had brought in. With that said, I will tell you, every single shade in this palette has been used, but there's a lot of non-use that also happened with this palette. I did use it to complete a couple different looks in and of itself. It didn't get as much use as the other 2, let's just be honest, but that's kind of how I roll. I am a color queen. We all know this. Let's start with the Melt Bailey Sarian palette, which is called Fatally Yours. This is the Melt Fatally Yours palette in collaboration with Bailey Sarian. This is a $58 palette. It has 10 eyeshadows in it at 0.63 ounces total, or 0.063 ounces per pan. And it did launch during the holiday seasons last year. It's not their holiday palette, but it did launch during that season. So what I love about this palette is it does have like Bailey's eyes here, which are, you know, pretty well known. If you know who Bailey Sarian is, you know, right? But if you don't, like, I encourage you, go check her out. She's amazing. Here it says Melt X Bailey Sarian here. It's called Fatally Yours. It has a little bit of like different textures for you to feel on the palette. It's really actually very cool. This is kind of shiny and glossy and slippy, whereas this one is a little bit rough, like ripped paper, right? Which is what it kind of looks like. And then we have raised Fatally Yours, and then this plaid goes from glossy to kind of grippy also. So the palette in and of itself also has some things for you to appreciate about it, some different textures. It says Fatally Yours on the spine. The back of it has those like textures also, and it just says Melt, Make Good Choices, which is Bailey's tagline, and then just some information about Melt down here floating at the bottom. When you open it up, it does have like the shadow thing in it that looks like this, which is just Bailey's eyes. And then it looks like this with a nice mirror, same as how Melt usually does. I gotta tell you, I'm just not a fan of the cutout mirror, but it doesn't really get in the way of you needing to do what you need to do. And then these are the shadows. There are 10 shadows in here, and it is all matte. These are mostly deep dark mattes, and they are actually quite a bit darker than they appear in the palette, and that was a little bit disappointing. It's a very grungy color story, super pigmented, super easily blendable in my humble opinion, and they remain pigmented as you blend them out. However, you are able to kind of get that multi-tonal eye look from just one shadow. If you want to go into them and create like this gradient, you are able to, because of how pigmented these are. Even though they stay pigmented on blend, you still can capitalize on the color and get a little bit more of a sheer wash of that color going up. There is some slight patchiness that occurs with this deep dark teal shade Strychnine, but it wasn't really problematic for me. I just have it as a note here. I didn't find any patchiness or voiding or any kind of problematic things about any of the other shades in this palette. Each shadow in this palette is named after a poison, which I think is super fun. If you know anything about Bailey Sarian, you know that she does Murder and Mystery Mondays, where she's doing her makeup and she's talking about like makeup murder mysteries. So it's very fitting that each one of these is named after a poison. She talks about poison all the time. I was actually surprised that not one of them was called Aqua Tavana, because it's one that comes up quite significantly in her stories, but I do believe that she had a collaboration with another makeup brand that she used that name in, so it makes sense. But I love that these are all named after poisons. It's kind of kitschy and neat. I also love that the palette has like these plaid imprints on the shades. I think that that is super fun as well. And as much as I use these palettes, those are some pretty deep imprints, because you can still see every single imprint of this palette, except for maybe this shade off on the corner, this kind of limey green shade. But that's because that shade actually came to me a little bit broken. This palette is talc-free, cruelty-free, gluten-free, and it has a 4.6 star rating on Melt with 228 reviews to encompass that 4.6 star rating. I think that's a fairly decent star rating, and it's probably about where I would place this palette as well, 4.5, 4.6. I think that my star rating would only go down from that 4.5 because I did have some patchiness with the teal shade, and because these are really, really dark, a lot darker than they appear in this palette. Even this one is super dark. This baby blue is by no means baby blue when you put it on your eyes. It's a very dark, dark blue, and I wish that this green actually showed up, this kind of like murky chartreusey green in an eye look, but it just doesn't. These are very, very dark, much darker than they appear in the pans. There was very little fallout with these, which I really love, because these are some pretty bold mattes, right? And there is a smidge bit of powderiness in the pan, but it doesn't translate to application process, that powderiness. However, with that said, they're not like super powdery in the pan. They are pretty powdery in the pan, but not super powdery in the pan. I think that you could get away with swatching them with your finger and have no problem. When you go in with a dense brush, you really have no problem. If you go in with a little bit more of a denser but fluffier brush, that's when you see that kick up in the pan happen. This is like any other Melt palette. You have to work very specifically with these shades. So place them, blend slightly, place a little bit more color, blend slightly, or you're going to have a mess all over your face, because these do stain quite a bit, and because even though they are pigmented and blend well, they don't blend as easily as, say, the Patrick Ta mattes did. These are best over a primed eye, and I would also encourage you to, if you're using a wet primer or a creamy primer or a tacky primer, and you don't want the color just to sit in one spot, you're going to need to put some kind of powder on top of that primer so that it sticks to nothing, because any remote amount of like tackiness or wetness, the pigmentation sticks to, and that's really where it sits. There is no like blending it out at that point. You can't You can't really move it. And that's one of the things that I honestly love the most about Melt Shadows, is that they keep their color overall, their pigmentation overall is just great. But it's also one of the things that I think steers a whole lot of people away from the brand. You have to be very, very specific about how you utilize the powders that come with Melt palettes, because they're just a very finicky formula. When I reviewed the Electrip palette, I said that I thought that it was maybe a different formulation. The mattes just kind of went on a little bit more sheer, a little bit less pigmented. They got there, but you had to build them up. This does not seem to be that same formula. It seems to be the good old, you know, Melt formula that those that are, of us that love Melt are used to and really love. These are not super buildable. If you try and pack these colors on top of each other, they do tend to void out any color underneath them or become very muddy. I mean, just these tones alone can get muddy, but I found more problems with them voiding out any color underneath them when you're packing them onto each other. They just kind of disappear. They just kind of void out. So truly place your color and then gently move it around versus packing it on, blending it out, and then packing more on. It just isn't going to work in that way. The wear time is approximately 8 to 10 hours, I would say, before there's any kind of like fading of the shades. However, these shades in this palette specifically, I don't think that there was one of them that I used that didn't stain my eyes, except for maybe this one didn't stain my eyes, but the rest of them were pretty potent. Now, with that said, I didn't find any kind of irritation that occurred from that. One thing that I was surprised about with these shadows too is that I do feel like I got an awful lot of creasiness out of this palette that I don't think I've ever experienced with Melt's mattes in the past. I did notice it more specifically in like this kind of rusty color, this kind of like burgundy color, and these two down here. So I really did try to keep those like deeper, darker tones above my crease, because I did find that if I put them into my crease, it did crease quite a bit. I will also say I have aging eyes. I'm not exactly a young duck around here, and I did find that it was a little bit more difficult to move these around the texture or the folds in my eyes, which made me sad. But it wasn't something that I couldn't do. I mean, obviously this whole eye look, except for the shimmer on my lid, is out of this palette and one of the mattes. I did go in with this light blue here. It is the blue that is kind of on the outskirts here. And then I also went in with this black on my outer V after piling some of this on top of each other, and didn't really love the outcome of it because it was starting to pick up the color underneath. Now the black just kind of cancels everything, but even still there is a lot of like patchiness happening out here because it doesn't like to like go on top of each other. And then the shimmer and the purple are out of the Smoke Sessions palette. There's just a lot of craziness that I found coming out of eye looks that I had with this palette that I don't normally experience from a matte shadow period, but it's most specifically a Melt matte shadow. With that said, it's not a palette that I don't love. I love these colors. The kind of grungy nature of it has always been like my jam. Born and raised in the Seattle area, really grew up in that era of grunge in Seattle, so it was very much a piece of my childhood that I remember so fondly and love so fondly, and still kind of sit in this place sometimes. So it was really, really a lot of fun to play with this palette. Some really great eye looks that I came up with. I would just say that if I want a deep dark matte, I know exactly which palette I'm going to, because even though these look Like, it does have a good amount of lightness to deepness. It's all very dark. It's all very, very dark in this palette. Let's walk through the shades. Again, I have a photo of swatches for you. Because I have 3 palettes here and there are so many swatches, I didn't want to do live swatches. I'd have you here for 4 hours doing that. So we have the first one, which is Arsenic. It is an apricot beige. I would say it leans more on the apricot side than the beige side, and I think that you guys can see that as well. We have Cyanide, which is kind of like that spicy brown mustard shade. I really like Heinz spicy brown mustard. It reminds me of that shade. Then we have Thallium, which is a really, really deep rusty orange. We have Mercury, which is a, they have it listed as a hazel brown. I would say it's more brown than it is hazel, but it does have a little bit of a green tinge to it to make it that hazel shade. Then we have Sarin, which is a really deep burgundy wine. We have Phosgene, which is a mossy lime green. I would say this is more moss than lime. So it does have a little bit of greenness to it, but it reminds me more of a camouflage green than as a mossy lime green. We have Ricin, which is, again, it reminds me of a camouflage that's less green than the one right before it. We have Kerosene, which is labeled a dusty baby blue, but this is a dusty blue, yes, but I would not say a baby blue. I do not think that this is light enough to be considered a baby blue, in my humble opinion. And I think that you can see just how dark that really is. We have Strychnine, which is a deep teal. This was one of my favorite shades in the palette and probably the most problematic, honestly, when dealing with how it performed with other shades and also just really how it performed on its own. And then we have Lead, which is black. Really, really great shadows. I had a lot of fun with these shadows, and it really kind of spawned some like deep, dark, grungy, like creativity in me, much like that of like ABH Subculture or something like that. I like this a lot more than ABH Subculture, if I'm honest with you. It reminds me of the color story of that, only maybe just a hint better. I enjoy the formula of this much better too. I would say that I don't have to be as particular about how I'm placing the shadows on my eyes with that palette as I do with the ABH Subculture palette. But I do think if you have Subculture, you maybe don't need this. I think that they're 2 very similar palettes. Would I repurchase it? I think so. Listen, I love Bailey, so it wasn't just the color story that got me for this palette, it was also the collaboration that got me for this palette. So I love Bailey, I love the color story, and I love that it's an all matte palette, if I'm honest with you. I know I've said this before, I do love me a shimmer. I have to have shimmers in my collection, but I do love palettes that have more mattes than shimmers because I wear more mattes than shimmers. So I really actually am keen to the fact that that palette is deep dark mattes and it's all mattes. The next palette that I have is the Melt Smoke Sessions 2 palette. And I think I unboxed this on camera and you guys saw my absolute awe of this palette because this is just much different than we have seen from Melt Cosmetics in the past. Number 1, it is kind of got this like 3D effect. Number 2, it is plastic. It's not cardboard like, well, the top is plastic. It's not cardboard like most Melt Cosmetics palettes. It's just truly beautiful. It is a plant of some sort on there. So this isn't necessarily my bag, but that is how Melt came about, right? This is their thing, and that's fine. I actually quite love the packaging of this palette, so it doesn't bother me. On the back of the palette just says, you know, Melt Smoke Sessions 2, has some information about the palette. It does say it has a 12-month shelf life. You open it up and it does have a mirror on it. It is very nice. It doesn't quite bend all the way back for me, but I do think it would. I'm afraid that because this one, the top of it is plastic, it might actually do a lot more damage than I want it to do. It does have like metallic pink leaves all over it, right? And each one of the shades is stamped the same way. And then we have this beautiful purple color story. So one thing I would say about this palette that is very reminiscent about the Bailey Sarian one as well is that these matte shadows are much darker than they appear in this. This is a $48 palette. It has 8 shades in it, 0.50 ounces of product in it, or 0.063 ounces per pan. It's one thing I love about Melt. They're very consistent in their palette structures. Everything in this palette is gorgeous. These purples just give me life. This was launched last April with a full collection: nail stickers, liners, duochrome eye gels, a bag, and a shirt. This one also came with a plethora of other things too. I wanted the bag for this so bad. It was a cute little heart-shaped bag. This one is like a crossbody, like bright green, like almost fanny pack looking thing. This is the sequel to the Smoke Sessions 1 palette, which was based on green strains, and this one is based on purple strains. And that is just not my journey. I don't know anything about green strains versus purple strains, but I do know that I think that this palette is gorgeous, so it doesn't matter to me. This does have 3 mattes and 5 shimmers, whereas one of them does seem a little bit more of like a topper. It is cruelty-free, talc-free, and 4 of the shades in this are vegan shades. They would be Northern Lights, which is this one here, Purple Punch, and then Monster Cookie and Martian Candies, which I thought was really cool. It is a very beautiful purple palette. Like, I am so glad that I have this in my collection. But again, there's not really any lightness here except for this 1, maybe 2 shimmers, and that's great. I can put those on my inner corner or whatnot, but they're not really something that I could put up in my brow bone. So this is just a complementary palette to another palette in my collection at best. I do think that these and any one of these shimmer shades in here make a really beautiful eye look. Really beautiful eye look, but I would need some lightness for in my brow bone area, in my inner corner, like tear duct area, because I'm not putting any of these mattes or honestly any of these shimmers into that tear duct area. This is best over a primed eye. Again, a dry primed eye for the mattes, but with the shimmers, my suggestion is to go over a glitter glue of some sort or a tacky primer or wet it. This is over a tacky primer today, and I just love this shade. And this is the Blue Haze shade, kind of topped a little bit with this on the very inner portions of the corners, and it just looks almost fluorescent to me in real life. It looks like my eyes are glowing, which is so exciting. These do have a minimum of an 8-hour wear. I would say that they probably would last much longer than that, but I didn't really wear them much longer than that. I can't be sure that they will last longer than that. I did wear these a couple of days, specifically the more toppery one, which is the Monster Candy, the one that I've got kind of in my inner corner today. And it is a little bit flaky in my eyes, and there was one day that I ended up taking my eyeshadow off really early after having put it on. It was bothering my eyes how much it fell out throughout the day into my eyes. But other than that, I didn't really have a whole lot of problem with blending any of these or getting them onto my eye or having them move around or anything like that. The packaging is stunning, truly chef's kiss. Each shadow in this palette is named after a marijuana strain of the purple nature, I think. These are super pigmented mattes. These are super blendable, and they do play well with the other palettes that I had them partnering with. The deeper purple on its own can lend to a little bit more patchiness. Again, they are a lot darker than they appear, and I think that you'll see that in the swatches. My absolute favorites were this shade that is on my lid today and this shade that isn't on my lid today. They're just so pretty. And this does have a 4.6 star rating at Melt with 51 reviews. Again, it is a rather new palette, so that review number is a little bit low. It has 3.5 stars on Google with 6 reviews, and it has 5 stars on Beauty Bay with 5 reviews. I think I would put it probably somewhere in the 4.5 star rating. I will say I'm really happy to have this in my collection. It is a beautiful purple palette, maybe even some of my favorite purple shimmers that I have in my collection thus far. It does have a really decent magnetic clasp on it, as does the Fatally Yours. I mean, they're built just like any other Melt Cosmetics palette is. I really appreciate that about their palettes. You always can look at a palette and know that it is a Melt palette as if it's part of their collection. So with that said, let's walk through the shades, because I think that you'll see these shades are just so pretty. They're just stunning. So first and foremost, we have Blue Haze. Like I said, this is one of my favorites. It's really this like electric, like indigo purple blue shade that's got a purple blue sparkle shimmeriness to it as well. It is what is in my eyes today, and it just looks backlit, which is awesome. Like, it's so awesome about this shadow. Every single time I wore this eyeshadow, somebody commented on the shimmer shade. So cannot with this shadow. I loved it so much. And then I also have Northern Lights. It also, in my humble opinion, looks backlit. It is so pretty. It's this like electric, like lavender purple with pink sparkles throughout it. It is just gorgeous. And Northern Lights is one of the vegan shades in this palette. Then I have Purple Punch, which is also another vegan shade. And this one is a deep eggplanty purple. It definitely looks like a blackened purple, like a violet shade. And I think that they actually have it called a violet shade on their website. But this one is a matte. Then I have Black Roses, which is a darker plum matte shade. Then we have Purple Skunk, which is a dark like mauve-y moment. This is also a matte shade, and this one is much darker than it appears in the palette, in my humble opinion, as it goes on the eye. There really is no light matte in this palette. You have Purple Goo, which is a frosted electric violet shimmer. I don't think this one is nearly as backlit as the two first shimmers in this palette, but it is still very purple and very pretty. You have Monster Cookie, which is one of the vegan shades in here. This one is more of a topper. It is kind of an amethyst, like pinky, sparkling topper shimmer. It has some girth to it, meaning like it has a little bit of like base shade to it, but it's not a lot of base shade to it. So you can pack it on and get this tone out of it, but it takes a little bit more effort to get that tone out of it than it does for, say, the Blue Haze shade at the front of the palette. And then you have Martian Candy, which is kind of this frosted lilac shade with a little bit of like almost shiftiness towards blue. It is a beautiful palette. Beautiful purple shadows. Like I said, they just look backlit. And I mean, really, that's all I can use to explain it. It truly looks like these are lights on my eyes. That sounds so stupid to say, but that's what it looks like in real life. So the last palette that I had to work with this week was the Patrick Ta Major Dimensions 3 eyeshadow palette. And this is just also another matte palette, and it is all neutral eyeshadow shades. This is what the front of the palette looks like. This is a $70 eyeshadow palette. It has 12 shades of shadow in it. 2 of them are creams, the rest are mattes. And it is 0.06 ounces of product per pan. The front of the palette, of all Patrick Ta's palettes, look like this with kind of the beveled edge, only not beveled, it just looks beveled. And then the Patrick Ta in the center. Each one of them looks slightly different though. So like the neutral one is a little bit more of a like champagne. The rosy one is a little bit more rosy or rose gold. And then this one is frosted here. Whereas the other ones really weren't frosted here, but it still has that rose gold to it. The back of the palette looks like this, so it does have a sticker on it telling you what the shades are, what their names are, because when you open up the palette, the shade names are not anywhere on the palette. It says Patrick Ta Measure Dimension 3. It has a little blurb about the palette on there, and it is a metal palette with a clasp, not a magnet. So, and the clasp is a really good clasp, like nothing's breaking through there. One thing that I like about Patrick Ta is you have a good full-size mirror here. I never take the stupid film off of the mirrors. And I also love that the 2 cream shadows have this little door here so that you don't have to worry about the powders getting into your creams, which is fantastic. Not all brands that have cream eyeshadows in their eyeshadow palettes do that. I think through the lens of like Huda doesn't do that, right? I do appreciate that about Patrick Ta's palettes. With this palette, you have a palette that launched this time last year. You have an all neutral palette and an all matte palette, except for these 2 cream shades here. You have the top row being warm neutrals and the bottom row being more cool tone neutrals, which I 100% appreciate about this palette, because whether you're a warm toned girl or a cool toned girl, you have every shade of brown that you could possibly need, to be honest, in this palette. One thing I would say about this palette that I have said about Patrick Ta in the past is I don't think that there are huge variations from about the 3rd shade on, specifically in this top row. For the bottom row, I think it's these 3 shades. There's not huge variations to the shades, but there is definitely more variation to these bottom 3 shades than there is to these top. With that said, if I were to put these 3 shades of brown into an eye look, I do think that you would be able to tell the difference between those 3 shades of brown in my eye look. But I do know that putting these 3 shades of brown into my eye look didn't really create a giant variation to the eye look, in which it looked like I maybe just had put one eyeshadow on and blended it out to a more sheer fashion in an eye look. There wasn't enough dimension across the warm shades as I feel like there was on the cool shades, but I do still also feel like the cool shades didn't have as much variation to them. That said, I don't know that there is a whole lot of variation that could happen and still get the gradient that you have in these palettes. Patrick Ta mattes are fantastic quality, and this palette is no different. This white shade was a favorite. I used it so often. I used it probably every day, either in brow bone or inner corner. Funnily enough, I am not wearing it today as a brow bone or inner corner, but I did use it to lighten up the blue from the Bailey Sarian palette in just this section of my eyebrow here, because it is dark. It's a lot deeper than I anticipated it would be. These blend like a dream. There's no patchiness or fading or voiding or anything as it pertains to this palette. It also builds well and plays well with others. Like, I really did not find any inconsistencies with this palette that were detriment to the eye looks that I was going after. There was a little bit of a disappointment with this white that I love so much in larger areas. I did try and complete a whole cool toned matte eye look, and on my lid, this white was just not as impactful as I wanted it to be. It really kind of like, almost laid on my eye and faded out immediately, whereas I felt like it was very stark in my brow bone, my inner corner. So over larger spaces, I felt like I needed to pack it on more to get the white out of it versus what I had to do in smaller spaces. So I just opted not to use it on my lid space again as an all over the lid shade, but it is truly beautiful. It was just slightly disappointing because I was going for a certain thing and I felt like I needed to pack it on to the extent that it felt kind of heavy on my eye and also looked kind of heavy on my eye. With that said, I don't think any of these shadows are heavy, so it was a weird feeling to feel that from these shadows when I was going for that look. The creams, I also don't love. I think I did like them initially in the other Patrick Ta palette that I have, but then when I tried to use them, you know, as a base, but then when I tried to use them as an eyeliner, I just felt like they don't stay. Yes, to some extent, they are waterproof in that I had a watery eye and they weren't budging from that watery eye, but as soon as I touched them, they went away. So if I went like this into my eye look and accidentally touched the edge of the like eyeliner that I had created with that cream shade, it was gone. It was just voided out on my eye. So that was a little bit disappointing as well. This is best over a primer, I would say, for longevity, but I don't think that a primer impacted whether it was blendable or whether it performed well as a simplified eyeshadow that you were trying to slap onto your lids. I had the best time with this palette when I was just putting one of these browns into my crease and then like a shimmer across the lid space. So like 2 shadows and you're done eyeshadow look. The problem is I was dealing with, you know, a lot of mattes, honestly, and only 5 shimmers. So I did use this most of the time when I was pulling for some of those shimmers in my Shop My Stash drawer and getting a little bit of use out of those. I felt like they partnered really well with them. One of my favorite looks was this shadow all over in the, I think it was this shadow all over in the crease, and then one of my green like multi-chrome liquid eyeshadows from About Face that I just put into my Shop My Stash. These wore honestly really horribly. I would say maybe 5 or 6 hours of wear time you're gonna get out of these shadows before they either completely disappear or start to fade pretty impactfully on your eye look. I was not pleased with an all over matte eyeshadow look with these shadows because it just didn't, by the time I got home from working for the day, like you couldn't even tell what was going on my eyes because this had just kind of disappeared throughout the day. So it's, again, much like this one, only for a different reason, maybe just a complementary eyeshadow palette in my collection. What is the most disappointing for me about this palette is that I chose this one over the Danessa Myricks Groundwork palette to purchase, and I by no means think that this was the better palette to purchase. And that makes me sad because it's a very expensive palette. $70 for a bunch of mattes is crazy, to be honest. And yes, I understand that there are 2 cream shadows in there, but that to me does not equate to the necessary price point of $70. Also, it doesn't have the crazy awesome shimmers that are in a lot of his other palettes, and those were the reasons to pay $70 for his other palettes, right? Those shimmers were fantastic. Shimmers takes more time. Shimmers cost more money. Mattes, not really. I do think that the price point on this palette should have been much less than what it is currently, and I would be remiss if I did not say that if you were on the fence much like I was in purchasing the Patrick Ta or the Danessa Myricks. Purchase the Groundwork palette over and over and over again is what I would suggest. This palette did have a 4.5-star rating on Sephora with 426 reviews that made up that star rating. It had a 4.6-star on Google with 1,009 reviews and a 5-star rating on Patrick Ta, of course, with 126 reviews that made up that star rating. I honestly would probably give this a 4 point, maybe a 4.2 at best. Mostly because, again, I couldn't get through a full day of work with this palette without coming home and my eyes looking crunchy, in that you couldn't tell what I had going on that day on my eyes because it had all like faded away. The creams just weren't fantastic for what I really think that they're built into this palette for, besides, you know, a base for these eyeshadows. And honestly, if you're using these creams as bases, like there are, you know, 11 different eyeshadow, or I guess 9 different eyeshadows in this palette, maybe 8 at most, or at least, that are not going to go well over the top of these 2 creams, because these 2 creams are the same color as these 2 shades, and there's a whole plethora of shades in here that you can't really put on top of those creams without those creams like taking away the color that you're going after for the other matte that you're putting in its place. So would I repurchase this palette? No. I think they're beautiful matte shadows, but they just don't last. So I am a person who puts my makeup on first thing in the morning. I wake up at 6 or 6:30. I usually have my makeup on my face by 8 or 8:30, and then I leave and I don't get home sometimes until 6 p.m. at night. So I need eyeshadows that are going to last at least as long as I am out for the day for my job. I think it's very overhyped, and I think that $70 was too much to pay for that eyeshadow palette. I did buy it last year, so I have well exceeded the time frame of being able to take this palette back. So it is a palette that will remain in my collection. But when it comes to like end of year ranking of palettes, I don't know where this one is going to stand, because it was, I don't know, disappointing-ish. It was good. And it's honestly got nothing to do with the color story in the reasons why I was disappointed with it. It's got to do with the performance. There you are. Let's talk about the shades, okay? So across the top, we have Non-Negotiable, which is the cream brown shade in the palette. Then we have Trademark, which is kind of a rusty reddy brown. Then we have Crucial, which I think is also like a red brown, but I think it's more brown than red, whereas the other one I think is a little bit warmer. Then we have Needed, which is kind of a rusty, an orangey rusty brown. Then we have Classic, which is more of a peachy nude shade. Then we have Mandatory, which is a beige, a creamy beige matte. The bottom row is our cool tones. We have Impressive, which is the black cream shadow. Then we have Irreplaceable, which is the black matte. Really great black matte, honestly. Then we have Fundamental, which is a really deep cool tone brown, kind of espresso looking, like a deep dark espresso. Then we have Essential, which was one of my favorite shades to use in this palette. It reminds me of like a dark sand tone. And then we have Staple, which is more of like a taupe. And then we have Refined, which is white. And like I said, I loved Refined. It was probably my most used in that palette, but definitely not great to use over larger spaces than Inner Corner and Brow Bone. With that said, that is the 3 palettes that I have been using over the last several weeks. I'm gonna go pick some new palettes. I will be right back. I am, I think, a glutton for punishment, because I do think that I'm gonna pull in 3 palettes again this time. And most of it is because I'm really excited about all 3 of these palettes. Secondarily to that, I have a lot of palettes still sitting in my drawer of shame. And even though all 3 of these are new, were than the ones that are still in there for the most part. I do think that these are the three that really call to me the most. Look, we're at the end of August, right? We're about to roll into September. September is fall time. So I am pulling in something that can, you know, get us from summer to fall, but also something that is very fall, just in case this takes me straight into fall. And then one that is just going to be something that will help bring it all together. So first things first, you guys just saw me do my makeup rehab in which I hauled in a bunch of new palettes. So first we're going to start with Dreamer palette. This is down in my comments section, one of the first ones that one of my subscribers suggested I start with. This is the palette. It looks the same as the packaging, and this is what the product looks like inside. And it is like purples, pinks, grays, very cool-ish tone. There's a little slight bit of warmth in there, but I am really excited about all of these palettes, to be honest. The other one that I am going to bring in is the Unearthly Not Normal palette, and I'm bringing this one in because it leans very fall. And I mean, truth be told, Western Washington feels an awful lot like it's fall already, but this is what this palette looks like. I feel like this can partner with the Dreamer palette in a really cohesive way, but I also think that it's got kind of more of those grungy tones that I also love so much. And then to bring it all together, I am going to bring in the Lunar Beauty Nude Prism palette, which is just a basic B palette, right? But it does have some swings and pops of like deeper like burgundies and browns and some oranges and some pinks in here that I don't think are in those palettes, because those palettes do lean very, very dark. I am really excited to bring this one in as well. Now, because there are so many different shades, this might take me a minute to get through, but I do think that I said that about the last ones too, and it didn't take me nearly as long as I thought it was going to take me. Those are the three palettes I'm going to come to you with next time we do this palette roulette. These are kind of panning out to be a once a month review, so you will likely see this about this time next month. If I get through them sooner, it'll be sooner, but I have an awful lot of shades to get through, and I'm so excited to get through these shades. So with that said, I hope that you guys enjoyed the video. I hope that you liked it enough to give it a big thumbs up, like the video, subscribe down below. Don't forget to comment. Let me know if you've tried any of these palettes, what you're excited to see from the three palettes I'm about to go into, what you want to know. I would love that too. And let me know your thoughts on the palettes that I just reviewed. I would love to hear your thoughts. So again, please don't forget to hit me up down in the comments section. Thank you guys so much for being here today. I appreciate every single one of you for being here. And, you know, just I hope that y'all are doing well. I hope that you are all safe, healthy, getting along as best you can. I hope that you are all loving each other, being kind humans, and living your best life. And until next time, bye friends.